When people talk about the biggest days of their lives, they usually describe them with warmth or nostalgia, or a kind of soft glow that memory naturally gives to moments that matter. For years, I imagined my Doctor of Physical Therapy graduation would be one of those shimmering memories. I pictured myself walking into the arena, the echo of hundreds of families cheering, the steady thump of the band, and the bright white lights sweeping across the rows of seats, where parents and siblings waved proudly at their graduates. I imagined the exact moment the announcer called my name, and how the sound of it would finally silence every doubt I had carried since childhood. Instead, the first thing I saw when I took my assigned seat on the polished concrete floor was two empty chairs with glossy paper signs that read, "Reserved for Family." They sat on either side of me like ghost witnesses to a life I had desperately tried to earn. Around me, the air was warm with excitement, people shouting names, cameras clicking, programs rustling like restless wings. My classmates pointed and laughed when they spotted their families packed tightly in the stands, waving balloons and flowers. I followed their hands upward, scanning the crowd with naive hope, telling myself my parents must simply be late, stuck in traffic hurrying through the doors any minute now. But the more I searched, the more the truth began to settle inside me like a quiet stone dropping to the bottom of a lake. They were not coming. There was no way to pretend otherwise. When the announcer stepped up to the microphone and the hall vibrated with applause for the first graduate, the cameras began their slow pan across the audience. I had imagined that moment 1,000 times, the shot of my parents clutching each other with pride, my mother crying, my father wiping his eyes and pretending he was not. Instead, the giant screen at the front of the hall showed strangers, a man in a baseball cap, a grandmother with a tiny American flag, a toddler chewing the corner of a program, people who did not know me, people who had not watched me fight through 10 years of schooling late nights at the rehab center, 16-hour rotations in orthopedic units, and the kind of exhaustion that leaves you shaking by the time you crawl into bed. I tried to swallow the sting, but it stuck like a thorn in my throat. Then my phone buzzed in my gown pocket. The vibration felt too casual, too careless for the ache inside my chest. I pulled it out, thinking maybe my mother was telling me they had reached the building, maybe they were rushing inside, maybe there was still time for this day to be saved. Instead, the screen lit with a message from my older brother Kyle. "Wish you were here," followed by a laughing face and two flaming icons. Beneath it was a photo of a massive backyard barbecue. Smoke rolled up from the grill like a celebration all its own. Paper plates stacked high with ribs and wings sat beside coolers overflowing with beer. People lounged in lawn chairs, sun hitting their sunglasses, faces relaxed and bright. And there, in the middle of the photo, stood my parents. My father held metal tongs like a man proudly hosting his kingdom. My mother stood beside him holding a bowl of salad, smiling wide, her shoulders loose, her face lit with easy joy. They looked happy. They looked free. They looked like they had nowhere else they were supposed to be. But the part that pierced through me with surgical precision was the timestamp at the top of the photo. It matched the exact minute the announcer had called the first graduate to stand. They had not mixed up the date. They had not gotten stuck. They were not rushing or apologizing or trying. They were at a barbecue. They were with Kyle. They had chosen laughter and smoke and lawn chairs over the daughter who had clawed her way through a degree almost no one in our family even understood. The sound in the arena seemed to stretch and bend like the air itself had shifted. I stared at the picture until the edges blurred not because of tears, but because something inside me had gone strangely quiet. A numbness crept in slow and cold, the kind that follows a wound you do not immediately feel. I wondered if the people around me could sense it. I wondered if anyone noticed the girl sitting between two empty chairs while the rest of the world erupted with joy. The announcer's voice echoed again as another graduate stepped up and the stadium exploded in cheers. My heart beat in my throat. I could not look at the crowd anymore. I looked instead at the two seats beside me and imagined what it would have felt like to hear my mother shout my name or see my father stand before anyone else did. I imagined them recording the moment blurry and shaky and imperfect, but present. And then I looked back at Kyle's message, his mocking tone radiating off the screen like heat from asphalt. Wish you were here. The truth was simple and sharp. They did not want to be here. They did not want to choose me. This was not an accident. This was not bad timing. This was a decision. And as I sat waiting for my row to be called diploma tube, waiting under my chair cap, itching against my scalp, something in me shifted. It did not shatter. It did not explode. It settled. A single, steady sentence rose inside me with the certainty of a verdict. This was not a mistake. It was a choice. And it was the moment that would change everything. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Long before the empty seats at my graduation became the final proof I could no longer ignore. There was a fantasy that kept me alive through every exam, every night shift, every moment I thought I would break under the weight of becoming someone no one in my family believed I could be. In that fantasy, my parents always sat in the front row, not because they understood what a doctor of physical therapy degree meant, but because they understood what it took for me to get there. I imagined my mother cupping her hands around her mouth to shout my name the way she did for my brother Kyle during his high school football games. I imagined my father standing up before anyone else, proud in a quiet way, but proud nonetheless. That vision was my oxygen. Whenever the coursework got so intense, I thought my skull would split whenever I was elbow deep in patient charts at 2 in the morning whenever I drove home from the rehab center, so exhausted my vision blurred at stoplights. I would whisper to myself that one day they would see me. One day they would realize the girl they dismissed as dramatic and sensitive was the one who never stopped trying. The strange thing about hope is that it grows roots even in poisoned soil. I had been fed favoritism since childhood, but I still believed that becoming the first person in our family to earn a doctorate would finally tilt the scales toward fairness. Kyle had always been the one they hovered around like anxious bees. He was the golden child, the one they excused, shielded, and called fragile, even when his behavior was anything but. He was 2 years older than me, built like someone who had learned early how to take up too much space, loud in every room he entered, quick to anger and quicker to blame. I grew up watching him throw tantrums that shook the house punch holes in his bedroom wall and shove me hard enough that I learned instinctively how to brace myself whenever he walked by. When I was 12, he pushed me down the last 3 steps of our staircase because I embarrassed him in front of his friends by asking too many questions. My elbow throbbed for days. My mother placed an ice pack on it, but scolded me, saying Kyle was under a lot of pressure, and I should not provoke him. My father told me to toughen up and stop being dramatic. When I was 15, Kyle ripped the charger out of my laptop so hard the port cracked. I had been working on a biology paper that counted for 40% of my grade. He said I was hogging the Wi-Fi. When I protested, he grabbed my wrist and yanked it down, fingers tight enough to leave faint bruises. Nothing that would show up in pictures, but enough for me to feel the ache when I rotated my hand during volleyball tryouts. My parents said boys roughhouse, and I needed to learn not to take everything so personally. At 16, he locked me out of my own bedroom because he wanted to take a nap in a quieter space and told my parents I was making a big deal out of nothing when I cried. They believed him. They always believed him. But still, I kept imagining that someday they would notice the difference between us. He coasted through life like he expected the world to rearrange itself around him. I studied like my life depended on it because in some ways it did. Scholarships were my only ticket out of that house. The day I received my acceptance letter into the DPT program, I ran down the hall and showed my mother the envelope, shaking with excitement. She glanced at it while stirring sauce on the stove and said that was nice, then asked if I had seen where Kyle left his keys. My father said congratulations, but his tone was distracted and he immediately shifted to reminding me that Kyle would need the family car for his construction job and I should plan around that. Still, I clung to the idea that once I had a white coat on my shoulders and a doctoral hood hanging down my back, they would finally realize how far I had gone without their help. I imagined one day sitting at a holiday dinner and hearing my father brag to relatives that his daughter was a doctor. I imagined my mother squeezing my hand in a rare moment of maternal pride. Those fantasies wrapped around me like a blanket during the nights when I studied until dawn, eating granola bars for dinner because I could not afford takeout, juggling clinical rotations that left me dizzy with fatigue, all while working an evening receptionist job at a small outpatient rehab center. There were days when I walked from room to room, helping stroke patients relearn how to step forward, coaxing their muscles back to life, feeling a strange sense of purpose that made the exhaustion worthwhile. But the truth was that when I went back to my empty apartment afterward, silence was the only thing that greeted me. My parents rarely visited. They rarely called unless they wanted to update me on Kyle or ask if I remembered to file some form on their behalf. They always said they would come see me when things slowed down, but things never slowed down because Kyle always needed something. I knew deep down that the quiet was a sign of something broken between us, but I refused to believe it was beyond repair. So I kept imagining that graduation day would fix everything. I imagined my father buying an extra memory card for his camera because he would not want to miss a moment. I imagined my mother crying when she saw me in my gown, the kind of tears that say everything you have ever longed to hear. I imagined Kyle cracking a joke, but still offering a grudging hug. I held on to that vision like a lifeline. In my mind, it was the day my family would finally stop seeing me as the background character in my own life. It was the day they would choose me for once. That fantasy was not naive. It was survival. It was the only thing that kept me going. And that is exactly why the reality hit like a blade. The morning of my graduation began in a kind of soft quiet that felt almost sacred, the kind of stillness you get right before the sun warms the windowsill and the world remembers to breathe again. I woke before my alarm, my heart thumping like it already knew something I did not. For a few long seconds, I lay there staring at the ceiling of my tiny Denver apartment and letting myself believe everything would unfold the way I had always imagined. My parents were probably already on the highway, probably arguing about which exit to take or whether they should stop for coffee. Kyle was probably still asleep since he never showed up anywhere on time unless it benefited him. In my fantasy, my mother would call any minute to tell me they were almost there. So when my phone finally buzzed on the nightstand, I sat up too fast, smiling before I even looked at the screen. There it is. I answered with a happiness I did not bother to hide. I said, "Hey Mom, are you close? Do you need parking directions?" And for half a second, I swear I could already feel the relief of hearing her excitement. Instead, her voice came through light and bright in the wrong way, the way someone sounds right before canceling plans. She said, "Sweetie, listen," and immediately my stomach tightened. I asked if something happened on the road, and she gave a tiny laugh that did not match the day. She said we mixed up the dates. At first, my brain refused to process the words because they made no sense. I asked what she meant, and she launched into an explanation so casual it felt surreal. Kyle was hosting a big barbecue today, she said, with clients and friends and people from his contracting network. They had already bought the food and prepped everything, and your father has been marinating the meat since yesterday. It is a big deal for your brother. We cannot cancel on everyone. We will make it up to you next week with a nice dinner. I froze and stared at the wall because it felt like the room had tilted sideways. I said, "You are not coming to my doctorate graduation." And she paused just long enough for the truth to crystallize. Then she sighed the same sigh I heard my entire childhood, the one that said I was making things harder than they needed to be. She repeated that it was a misunderstanding and they would celebrate properly later. My pulse raced in my ears. 7 years of work, 7 years of exhaustion, 7 years of waiting for this moment, and she said it like she was canceling brunch. Before I could respond, I heard muffled movement and then my father's voice saying, "Give me the phone." He came on with that calm, tired tone he always used to shut me down. He said, "Madison, do not start. We are proud of you, but it is just a ceremony. They say your name, you walk, you sit down. You already accomplished the hard part. You know we support you." I felt something slip in my chest, not breaking, just releasing the last of my hope. I said quietly, "If you supported me, you would be in those seats." His breath hitched with annoyance. He said, "You know how much work went into this barbecue. You know how much Kyle depends on events like this. People are expecting us. We cannot blow them off to sit in a crowd and listen to names we do not know. We will celebrate next week. Do not be dramatic." And there it was, the sentence that had followed me like a shadow my entire life. Do not be dramatic. It was what they said when Kyle shoved me and I cried. It was what they said when he broke my things and called me names. It was what they said when they left my middle school play at intermission because Kyle had a friend waiting. It was what they said when they forgot parent-teacher night or skipped my scholarship reception. It was the bandage they slapped over every wound they did not want to acknowledge. Hearing it now on the morning of the biggest accomplishment of my life hit with a cold clarity that sucked the air from my lungs. I did not yell. I did not plead. Something inside me had already begun shutting down a quiet mechanical process like a system protecting itself from total failure. I said, okay. My voice sounded flat like someone else was speaking. Have fun at the barbecue. My mother grabbed the phone again and said, do not say it like that, we will celebrate. Send us lots of pictures, we want to see you on stage. I hung up before I could say anything unforgivable, then sat there in the stillness with the phone pressed to my leg. I could feel the last thread connecting us thinning to nothing. A part of me wanted to crawl back into bed and skip the ceremony entirely, but a colder part of me understood exactly what would happen if I did. They would tell everyone I backed out at the last minute, that I got emotional, that I could not handle the pressure. That narrative would spread the way all their narratives about me spread, so I forced myself to get ready, pinning my cap as my hands trembled. The car ride to campus felt slow and dreamlike, every street and stoplight passing like I was trapped inside someone else's day. Families streamed toward the arena carrying flowers and signs, people hugging, laughing, taking pictures. I walked among them alone. The loneliness was not new, but the weight of it had never pressed on me like this. I kept hearing my father's voice in my head. It is just a ceremony. Maybe to him it was. Maybe everything that mattered to me had always been just something to shrug off. But as I pushed open the heavy arena doors and saw hundreds of families packed shoulder to shoulder while 2 empty seats waited for me, I realized this call had done something irreversible. It had taken the fantasy that kept me alive and cracked it straight down the middle. And once something cracks like that, it does not mend. It breaks clean. When I stepped into the arena, the noise hit me all at once like a wave of heat from an opened oven door, a wall of cheers and clapping and camera shutters clicking in rapid bursts. Families were packed shoulder to shoulder in the stands, waving signs and bouquets that smelled faintly of crushed eucalyptus and grocery store roses. The brightness of the overhead lights made everything shimmer slightly, as if I had walked into someone else's dream. I kept moving because everyone else kept moving, hundreds of graduates in identical gowns shuffling down the wide aisle toward their sections on the main floor. My eyes scanned the crowd, automatically searching for faces I knew would not be there, but the reflex was stronger than the truth. People called out names, frantic and joyful, and the sound pierced me in places I did not know still held hope. I slipped into my assigned seat between the 2 chairs marked reserved for family, the same ones I had stared at earlier with the kind of disbelief that feels almost childish. Seeing them up close was worse. The white placards fluttered slightly each time someone in the row behind us shifted. Those empty seats felt like accusations, like proof I was foolish enough to keep wishing for something long after it was obvious it would never come. A woman in front of me kept craning her neck and waving up at the stands, her perfume drifting back toward me in sweet floral bursts each time she lifted her arm. At one point she turned around, cheeks flushed from excitement, and said, "I see my husband and kids up there. Do you see yours?" I forced a smile. I said yes before quickly turning back toward the stage so she would not ask anything else. She kept talking to her neighbor about how her youngest had made a huge sign and how her husband nearly cried when they walked in. Their laughter mixed with the roar of the crowd while my chest tightened in silent knots. The dean stepped up to the podium, his voice booming through the speakers as the ceremony began. Graduates, faculty, honored guests. The words rolled on each sentence, swallowed by applause. And then the moment came when he said, "Please stand, turn to your families, and thank them for supporting you on this journey." The sound of hundreds of chairs scraping simultaneously echoed through the arena like a strange kind of choir. Everyone rose around me. I rose too because staying seated would draw even more attention. I turned with everyone else. The sea of arms shooting up toward the stands looked like a field of waving flags. Phones raised high. Parents shouting their children's names, grandparents leaning forward for a better view. A little boy in the 4th row held a sign shaped like a graduation cap. A teenager in a blue hoodie recorded her sister with shaky hands. A woman in a red dress cupped her hands around her mouth and screamed a name so loudly the entire section cheered with her. The sight was overwhelming in the way lightning is overwhelming, bright and painful and impossible to look away from. My eyes moved instinctively toward the section where my parents would have sat if they had cared enough to show up. Instead of my mother's anxious smile or my father's attempt at stoic pride, I saw strangers. A middle-aged man adjusting his camera strap. A small girl with braids swinging her legs against the seat in front of her. An elderly couple sharing a bag of popcorn even though food was not technically allowed. No one who belonged to me. No one who even knew my name. My hand lifted weakly, then fell halfway because there was no one to wave to. The woman in the front row who had asked about my family earlier caught my eye for a second. Her expression softened in a way that felt unbearable, as if she guessed the truth I was trying so hard to hide. I turned back to the stage before she could say anything. When the music swelled and the line of graduates began forming to approach the steps that led to the stage, my heart thumped in a slow, heavy rhythm. I clutched my program even though I had already memorized everything printed on it. I watched the first graduates' parents leap to their feet, shouting and clapping so loudly that the dean paused to smile at them. I watched another student get hugged so hard she stumbled. Every cheer felt like it brushed the tender, bruised part of my heart, snapping against the same spot again and again. The row in front of me shifted as the students walked out. My row stood next. I followed the line forward, staring at the floor, so I would not accidentally meet the gaze of someone celebrating something I would never have. When it was my turn to hand my name card to the announcer, I placed it in his palm with fingers that felt strangely numb, as if the nerves had simply shut off. I heard my name through the speakers. Dr. Emily Parker. For a split second, time slowed. I walked across the stage with a smile that felt like a mask painted onto my face. The applause around me did not belong to me. It belonged to the ceremony itself and the people cheering for their own graduates. The bright lights washed out the crowd when I tried to glance upward. There was no familiarity, no one rising for me, no one shouting my name with pride, no parent recording every second on a phone held too close. I shook the dean's hand, accepted the diploma tube, paused for the photographer, and stepped down the stairs on the other side with my heart sinking lower with each step. When I reached the floor again, the cameraman operating the huge camera on the rolling track scanned the crowd for my cheering section. His lens glided past clusters of families celebrating wildly. Then it moved right past the 2 empty seats in my row and kept going. After the ceremony, students flooded out into the courtyard where families swarmed their graduates. Flowers everywhere, balloons bobbing in the breeze, confetti drifting like bits of metallic snow. Parents hugged their children so tightly they lifted them off the ground. Siblings tackled one another in laughter. I stood at the edge of it all, holding my diploma tube with both hands as if gripping it tightly would keep me from falling apart. The ache inside me felt so raw I could barely breathe. I kept pretending to scroll on my phone so no one would notice I was standing alone. But a woman in her 50s walked by, slowed, and came back. She asked in a voice too gentle for that moment if I wanted a picture with my family. I smiled because I had no other defense. I told her I was alone. She looked at me with something that was not pity exactly, but recognition, the kind of understanding that only comes from knowing how much loneliness can hurt. She took a picture for me anyway. Her kindness cracked something in me I had been trying so hard to hold together. I thanked her and walked away before the tears could fall, alone on the most important day of my life. After the ceremony emptied into a blur of laughter and family photos and flower bouquets crushing under people's arms, I drifted to the far edge of the courtyard where the noise softened into something distant and hollow. The fountain at the center of campus sprayed arcs of water that caught the sunlight just right, making tiny rainbows appear and disappear in the air. I lowered myself onto the stone ledge surrounding it, letting the spray of mist cool my face while the weight of everything finally pressed down with its full force. My diploma tube rested across my lap like a prop from a play I had never truly been cast in. Around me, students were swallowed into the warm chaos of parents hugging them siblings, elbowing their way into pictures, couples holding phones high for group photos where everyone smiled with their whole faces. It felt like watching life happen through glass. I would have given anything in that moment to be mistaken for someone waiting for her family to arrive late. I kept glancing toward the entrance of the courtyard as if maybe against all logic my parents would appear after all breathless and apologetic, but logic had already stopped protecting me hours ago. I knew they were not coming. Still, there is a strange instinct in the human heart that looks for hope even after it has been buried. That instinct made me pull out my phone. I stared at the blank screen for a moment before it lit up with a new notification. A message from Kyle. At first, I thought maybe, just maybe, it would be something decent, something that acknowledged the day. Instead, it was another photo casually sent like the first one had not already gutted me. The image filled my screen. The grill was piled even higher now, chicken thighs glazed with barbecue sauce, steaks lined up like trophies, the kind of spread people brag about at summer cookouts. Someone had brought a giant cooler of beer. A group of men in polos clinked their bottles together. In the background, I saw my parents again. This time, my father had a towel thrown over his shoulder like he was hosting a championship event, laughing with a confidence I had never seen him show at any school function of mine. My mother had her arm linked with the wife of one of Kyle's business contacts, smiling like she had not a care in the world. And then I saw it. The timestamp. Bold white numbers at the top of the screen. The exact minute I had stepped onto the stage and heard my name echo through the arena. The exact minute the cameraman had searched for my family and found empty seats instead. The exact minute dozens of other graduates were met with roaring applause from the people who raised them. My breath caught in my throat. I zoomed into the photo, my fingers pinching the screen until the pixels blurred. They looked so at ease, so unbothered, so content being anywhere but where a parent should be. My phone buzzed again before I could blink. Kyle had added a caption. "Wish you were here." Same laughing emoji. Same flame icons that felt like a mockery of every burning thing inside me. For a moment, I felt something sharp and hot rise up, the beginning of a cry or a scream, or maybe both. But then something unexpected happened. The heat cooled. It cooled so suddenly and so completely that the shift felt almost physical, like a gust of icy wind had swept through my ribs and extinguished every flicker of hope left inside me. My body relaxed in a way that frightened me at first. My shoulders dropped. My jaw unclenched. My hands stopped trembling. The ache did not vanish, but it changed shape. It became still, flat, quiet. The kind of quiet that usually comes after devastation. Evidence does not lie. Evidence does not negotiate. Evidence does not plead with you to see what is not there. Evidence simply is. And the evidence was undeniable. They did not forget. They did not try. They did not choose me. They had chosen my brother again the same way they had chosen him every time before. They had chosen convenience. They had chosen comfort. They had chosen to avoid anything that required acknowledging the work I had done or the daughter they never truly saw. Somehow, that realization did not break me. It clarified me. It felt like someone wiped fog off a mirror I had been staring into for 27 years. I could finally see the truth clearly, and once you see a truth that sharp, there is no unseeing it. The fountain behind me roared louder for a second, a rush of water that sounded almost like applause for a decision forming quietly inside me. A family does not skip your graduation by accident. A family does not send barbecue photos at the exact moment your name is called unless they want you to feel something. And what they wanted me to feel had nothing to do with love. I sat there for a long time, letting the mist from the fountain speckle my gown while the sun moved lower in the sky. The crowd thinned. Confetti stuck to the pavement. A little girl in a purple dress chased bubbles blown by her father. I watched them for a moment, the easy tenderness between them, the way she laughed when he lifted her into his arms. It looked like the kind of love I always thought my family would eventually grow into. But love cannot grow where effort never existed. Eventually, I stood up, brushing off my gown and gripping the diploma tube with a steady hand. The day had not broken me. It had revealed me. And the truth standing there in the open was simple. I was done being the invisible daughter. The fantasy I had carried for so long collapsed right there beside that fountain, and in its place, something stronger took shape. A decision, a turning point, the breaking point. Evidence does not lie, and now neither would I. Long before the empty chairs at my graduation and the barbecue photos that carved the final truth into me, there was a childhood I spent years trying to bury under achievements, degrees, clinical hours, and the hope that if I just accomplished enough, the past would stop reaching for me. But memories have a way of resurfacing when the present cracks open, and sitting by that fountain on the most important day of my life, all the things I had pushed down began to rise again with startling clarity. I grew up in a house where Kyle's voice always seemed louder than the walls could contain. He was the center of everything. When he was happy, the whole house buzzed with his energy. But when he was angry, the air tightened like a storm building pressure. I learned early how to read the signs, the heavy footsteps, the sharp slam of a door, the way he inhaled through his nose before snapping. Being 2 years older gave him the authority he believed he deserved, and our parents reinforced that belief every time they told me he was going through a rough patch or needed extra understanding. When I was 12, the first real moment of fear happened on a Saturday afternoon when Kyle had friends over. I was doing homework at the kitchen table when I asked him a question about a science project, excited because he actually seemed nice that day. His friends laughed at something on a video game, and Kyle turned toward me with a glare I still remember in perfect detail. He told me to leave him alone. I backed up quickly, but not quickly enough. As I turned toward the stairs, he shoved me from behind, not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough for me to hit the last few steps on my way down. I remember the sting in my elbow, the way the carpet burned my skin, the ringing silence after his friends fell quiet. But what I remember most was my mother rushing over only to scold me for standing too close to the boys, and my father telling me to toughen up because brother's roughhouse. Kyle did not apologize. He never did. When I was 15, I stayed late after school for a biology paper worth nearly half my grade. I came home determined to work. Kyle was pacing the hallway, annoyed about slow Wi-Fi, annoyed about everything. I set my laptop on the dining table and plugged it in, and within seconds he yanked the charger so hard it cracked the port. He said something about me hogging the internet even though he had not even tried to use it. When I protested, he grabbed my wrist and pulled it downward. The grip was not enough to cause visible damage, but it was tight enough that I could feel it for days whenever I rotated my hand in volleyball practice. I showed my mother the faint marks. She said Kyle was stressed. My father said I had always been too sensitive. When I was 16, Kyle decided he wanted my room because it was quieter and the walls were thicker, and he locked himself inside for hours while I stood outside with a sinking feeling in my stomach. When I complained, my father told me to stop causing problems and sleep in the guest room. When I tried to unlock the door, Kyle yelled that I was ruining everything, and my mother told me I needed to calm down and not blow things out of proportion. I slept in the guest room for a week before Kyle gave the room back, but only after he left it messy and smelled of the cologne he used too much of. These moments were not dramatic explosions. They were the slow grind of being erased. The little ways you learn you are not supposed to take up space in your own home. The countless times I was told not to overreact when Kyle shouted at me for touching the remote, or when he shoved past me in the hallway, or when he slammed my textbooks shut because he needed the table. The word dramatic became the family anthem, a convenient way to silence me whenever I tried to explain what had happened. I grew up learning that my emotions were liabilities, things to be contained, softened, dismissed. I learned to shrink myself so Kyle would not get angry. I learned to apologize even when I had done nothing wrong. The pattern was so familiar that by the time I moved out for college, I thought it was normal to walk on eggshells around people who claimed to love you. During my early college years, I tried not to think about home at all. I buried myself in coursework and hospital rotations in the kind of exhaustion that leaves no room for remembering. But every time my parents called, it was always about Kyle. Kyle needs help with this. Kyle is having a hard time. Kyle might stop by your place if he is in your area. And the worst part was the way my body still tensed whenever I heard his name like I was 12 again on the stairs. It was not until I was deep into my DPT program that I realized how skewed my perception of normal had become. We had a lecture on family dynamics and adverse childhood experiences, and as the professor went through examples, I felt a cold sensation spreading through my chest. I recognized every pattern: minimizing, excusing, blaming the quieter child, calling fear dramatic. I remember sitting in the lecture hall unable to move for a moment, wondering how many years of my life I had spent mistaking survival for harmony. But I still held on to the idea that maybe my parents would grow, that maybe adulthood would equal clarity, that maybe my graduation day would finally tilt the scale. Which is why the empty seats hurt, in a way that felt familiar and new at the same time. It was not just that they missed my ceremony. It was that the moment I saw those chairs, the entire weight of my childhood dropped onto me again with perfect precision. They had always chosen Kyle's comfort over my safety, his convenience over my milestones, his storms over my stillness. And they had chosen him again. The childhood I tried to forget had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to remind me of the truth. And that moment arrived the second I saw my name called and no one stood for me. That night, after the courtyard had emptied and the last clusters of families had drifted away in cars stuffed with flowers and balloons, I drove back to my apartment in a silence so thick it felt like I was moving underwater. The golden hour light washed over the buildings as if the world were gently closing the chapter on a day that had meant everything to me and nothing to the people who should have cared. When I walked inside the apartment, the air felt stale, as if the space itself sensed the shift inside me. My cap and gown still hung over the back of a kitchen chair where I had tossed them that morning, full of hope that now felt almost childish. I set my diploma tube on the countertop, its red ribbon bright against the dull laminate, and stood there staring at it for a long time. It felt like holding a piece of myself I had fought tooth and nail to build, but the hands that should have been clapping for me were nowhere near this room. I walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, cupped cold water in my palms, and pressed it to my face. It grounded me just enough for the numbness to recede and something sharper, clearer, steadier to rise in its place. I dried my hands slowly, then sat at the small dining table where I had spent countless hours studying for anatomy labs, neuro exams, and rehab practicums. My laptop sat closed, its surface reflecting the last glow of sunset. I opened it, the familiar startup sound echoing in the quiet. The cursor blinked at me as though waiting for a confession. I typed without thinking. Legal name change process, Colorado. The words appeared on the screen with a kind of finality that made the tiny hairs on my arms lift. At first, it was just curiosity, or that is what I told myself. I clicked through government pages, read the steps, skimmed the fee requirements, and scrolled through sample petitions. File a petition, attend a hearing, publish a notice, update documents. It was surprisingly simple. Almost too simple for something that could sever the last thread tying me to a name that had never really made room for me. But the thought did not feel impulsive. It felt earned. It felt like the only way forward. I leaned back in my chair, letting the memory of my grandmother drift into focus. She was my mother's mother, Margaret Ellis, the only adult in my childhood who ever looked at me with an expression that said she genuinely saw me. She attended every school event she could. She mailed me handwritten notes that smelled faintly of lavender and old paper letters that said things like, "I am proud of you, even when your parents forget to say it, and you deserve to be celebrated every chance you get." After she died when I was 19, the house became colder in a way I could never explain. There was no one left who could challenge the family narrative that Kyle needed everything and I needed to take up less space. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet, pulled down a heavy shoebox tucked behind blankets, and brought it to the dining table. The cardboard was soft at the edges, worn from years of being carried between apartments, as if it were something fragile that deserved careful handling. I opened the lid and the scent of old paper rose like a ghost. Her letters sat bundled with a thin piece of twine. I untied it and spread the envelopes across the table. One letter from the summer I turned 13 caught my eye. She had written, "Some families give love like sunlight, warm and steady and constant. Others make you fight for every drop. Do not stay where you are starving." I traced my thumb over her signature. Margaret Ellis. Ellis. A name that tasted like the only safe place I had ever known. A name that carried no weight of excuses, no echoes of dismissiveness, no history of silence. I whispered it out loud. Emily Ellis. The sound of it spread through me like the first deep breath after surfacing from underwater. It felt like stepping into a version of myself that had been waiting patiently for years. Parker had always felt like a coat 2 sizes too small, something I wore out of obligation, not identity. But Ellis felt like oxygen. It felt like choosing myself. I opened a new browser tab and downloaded the official petition. The document looked simple enough, just blank fields and checkboxes, but I felt my pulse rising as I typed my name into the top line. Emily Parker. Seeing that name on the form made me pause. It struck me how much of my life I had spent trying to perfect myself under a label that had never protected me, never lifted me, never chosen me. I deleted Parker. The blinking cursor hovered for a long second as if asking if I really meant it. I typed Ellis. Emily Ellis. My hands stopped shaking. The stillness inside me deepened, settling into something solid. I filled out every line carefully, the way I had once filled out scholarship applications, determined and focused. Each typed word pulled me further from the version of myself who cried on the stairs as a child, who stayed quiet when Kyle shoved past her, who begged for recognition that never came. When the final page appeared requiring a signature, I picked up my pen and signed my new name with a steadiness I had not felt in years. It was more than paperwork. It was burial and rebirth in the same breath. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the moment expand inside my chest. It felt like the quiet just before sunrise when you know something new is coming, but the world has not yet taken its first breath. For the first time in my life, I was choosing my own identity, not the one handed to me, not the one formed around Kyle's needs, not the one shaped by parents who never looked up long enough to see me. I whispered it again. I would not be a Parker anymore. And the room seemed to echo it back like a promise. The morning after I submitted the petition to change my last name, the world outside my apartment looked exactly the same, but something in the air around me felt unmistakably different, like the atmosphere after a storm has shifted the pressure without anyone noticing yet. Sunlight filtered through my blinds in long, soft stripes across the floor, and for the first time in my life, I woke up feeling like I was not carrying generations of obligation on my shoulders. I made coffee slowly, savoring the quiet, the hum of the machine, the rising warmth of the cup in my hands. It felt almost ceremonial, a private moment marking the start of a life no one in my family had any claim to. I logged onto my email to send the certified letters the court required, the official notice informing my parents and Kyle of my name change petition. The words looked clean and cold on the screen. Effective immediately, I will be known as Emily Ellis. Please update all records accordingly. No apology, no explanation. Just fact. I printed the letters, slid them into envelopes, and mailed them at the drop box near the corner coffee shop. As soon as the envelopes left my hand and disappeared into the metal slot, I felt a calm settle over me, not triumphant, not vengeful, just steady. It was the calm of someone who had stopped trying to win a rigged game. I spent the afternoon cleaning my apartment, folding laundry, reorganizing my bookshelf, trying to create order in the place that finally felt like mine. The silence held until a little after 4 when my phone started vibrating across the countertop. Mom flashed across the screen. I let it ring. 30 seconds later, it rang again. 8 missed calls. Then the first voicemail notification. I waited until the screen stopped blinking before pressing play. Her voice came through high-pitched and frantic in a way I had not heard since the time Kyle dented a neighbor's mailbox and she worried about how it would make the family look. She said, "Emily, what is this letter? Why would you do this? Your father is furious. You cannot just change your name. You are humiliating us. Do you understand how this makes us look?" The emphasis was always on look, never on feel. Not once did she say she was hurt that she missed my graduation. Not once did she ask how I was. I deleted the voicemail and walked to the fridge for water. The phone rang again. This time it was Kyle. I could practically feel the heat of his temper radiating from the screen. I let it go to voicemail. 5 seconds after it beeped, there was another incoming call. Another voicemail. I let the apartment fill with the noise of it like a siren winding up from a distance. Finally, I hit play. His voice came through sharp and laced with anger that simmered just below the surface. He said, "What the hell are you doing? You think changing your name makes you better than us? You think this is some kind of revenge, grow up and stop acting like a victim." At the end, he added a line meant to intimidate me the way he always had. "You are going to regret this." The threat was vague, not explicit, but the intention was clear. It hit my ears differently now, though. It did not sink into my nerves the way it did when I was 16 and he slammed doors in my face. It bounced off. I replayed the voicemail once more, not to absorb the words, but to feel the absence of fear. It was gone. My father called next. 1 ring, 2 rings, 5. Voicemail. I did not listen to it right away. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out at the mountains in the distance, blue and still against the late afternoon sky. I found myself thinking about how many times I had waited for his approval as a kid, how many times I had tried to earn praise that never came, how many times he had held up Kyle's highs as excuses for ignoring my own milestones. When I finally pressed play, his voice was calm in that cold, clipped way he used when he believed his authority should be enough to correct anything. He said, "Your mother is upset and you need to fix this immediately. A name does not change blood. You will always be a Parker and you cannot just erase that because you are angry. Call us back." The message ended with a tension-filled silence. I stared at the phone for a long moment before whispering to myself, "It changes access. It changes who gets to claim me. It changes who gets to hurt me." The shift inside me was complete by then. Every voicemail confirmed it. They were not scared of losing me. They were scared of losing control. My phone buzzed again this time with a string of texts from family members I had not spoken to in months. "Your mom is crying. You need to make this right. Kyle is upset. Your father is embarrassed. Not a single, 'Are you okay?' Not a single, 'What happened at graduation?' Not a single acknowledgement of what they had done. Just attempts to rope me back into the role I had outgrown." The next morning, my mother tried a different tone, one soaked in guilt that dripped through the phone like syrup. She texted, "This is breaking the family. Please do not ruin everything over one misunderstanding." I sat at my kitchen table reading it while sipping coffee, marveling at how perfectly those words captured the pattern of my entire life. One misunderstanding. That was their favorite refrain. It was one misunderstanding when Kyle shoved me down the stairs and she told me not to make a scene. It was one misunderstanding when he damaged my laptop and my father told me not to be dramatic. It was one misunderstanding when they missed parent-teacher conferences, scholarship ceremonies, birthdays, and eventually the most important day of my life. Their denial was not new. It was simply louder now because it finally had consequences. The panic calls kept coming, but each one felt like another confirmation that I had made the right decision. I did not answer any of them. I did not explain myself. I owed them no clarity after a lifetime of being denied it. Late that evening, as the sun slipped behind the Rockies, casting long purple shadows across the apartment, I opened my laptop again. I clicked on the pending court hearing date, starred the email, and whispered my new name under my breath. Emily Ellis. It felt steadier this time, stronger, sharper. It felt like the first truth I had spoken entirely for myself. The first consequence of choosing myself was their panic. The second was my peace. I never planned to expose anything. That is the truth I repeated to myself weeks later when people accused me of trying to ruin my family. But in the beginning, all I wanted was a place to breathe without their voices echoing in my head. The panic calls had slowed, but they still came at random hours, and every time my phone lit up with Kyle's name or my parents' initials, my chest tightened with the same old reflexive dread I thought I had outgrown. One night, overwhelmed by the weight of everything left unsaid, I sat on my living room floor with my laptop balanced on my knees and typed the words that had been living behind my ribs since graduation. I titled the page The Ghost Child Diaries, mostly because it felt strange to use my real name, and partly because Ghost Child was the phrase that had floated through my mind the night I saw my parents smiling in the background of Kyle's barbecue photos. while my row of reserved seats stayed empty. I wrote without stopping, without editing, without softening the truth to make it more palatable. I wrote about the childhood bruises explained away as accidents, the cold dinners eaten alone, while Kyle told jokes in the kitchen with my parents, the report cards no one read, the milestones no one attended. I wrote about the staircase where he shoved me when I was 12, the cracked laptop screen when I was 15, the night he grabbed my wrist too hard when I tried to retrieve my missing essay from under his bed. I wrote about the constant chorus of, "You are overreacting. You are too sensitive. You know how your brother gets, let it go. Do not be dramatic." And then I wrote about graduation day. I described the empty seats, the time-stamped barbecue photos, the moment I heard my full name echo through the auditorium and realized that no one who shared that name was present. I did not use their names. I did not identify the city. I did not share my program or school. It was anonymous and untraceable by design. I hit publish because the silence of keeping everything inside had become unbearable. I closed my laptop and went to bed without expecting anything. The next morning, the post had 47 views. By evening, it had 2,000. By the time I left for work the next day, it had been shared on a subreddit for adult children of narcissistic families, and someone had reposted it in a group for therapists discussing generational trauma. Comments poured in. "I feel this in my bones. I lived this. I cried reading this. You are not alone. Not one person doubted my story. Not one person said I was dramatic." The validation hit me so hard that I had to sit down on the edge of my bed because for the first time in my life, strangers understood a version of me my own family had refused to see. Within a week, the post had circulated through multiple online communities, especially among women in their 40s and 50s who saw their childhoods reflected between my lines. It was surreal watching the world respond to pain I had carried alone for so many years, but the ripple effects reached my family faster than I expected. I learned that part indirectly when I overheard two coworkers talking during lunch. They were scrolling through their phones, and one of them said, "Have you read that blog about the girl whose parents skipped her doctoral graduation to go to her brother's barbecue? It is going viral." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I kept my face still, pretending not to hear. My phone buzzed an hour later with a message from a cousin I barely spoke to. "Is that blog about you?" "People are saying it is." I did not respond. 2 hours later, Kyle called. I declined it. He called again. Declined. Then came the voicemail. His voice was angrier than anything I had heard since high school, like the kind of rage he used to unleash when no adults were around. He said, "If that blog is you, take it down right now. This is destroying my reputation. Do you understand that people are calling me unstable? I am losing business because of you." The irony hit me like cold water. For the first time in our lives, my truth had consequences for him. I played the voicemail twice, stunned by how quickly the fear in his tone shifted to panic when his image was threatened. I did not take the blog down. I did not even edit it. 2 days later, my mother left a voicemail in a trembling voice. She said, "Your brother is devastated. People are saying terrible things about him, and this is your fault. You need to fix this." Not one mention of my graduation. Not one question about how I felt. Not one acknowledgement of the years of damage they pretended not to see. Just panic about their social standing. My father called shortly after and left another message. He said, "Emily, whatever you think you are doing, this is not the way to do it. You are humiliating all of us. Take that blog down immediately and stop airing private matters." I sat on my couch listening to his voice, realizing that the private matters he was so desperate to protect were the very things that had kept me small for 27 years. The blog kept spreading. Someone wrote an article about it on a mid-sized online magazine that covered mental health and family estrangement. A therapist used excerpts in a podcast episode about emotional neglect. People debated whether the parents in the story deserved forgiveness. Some insisted that the writer was brave. Others said they wished they had left their families earlier. I never added another post. I never clarified anything. I never claimed ownership. I simply watched. And as the story drifted further away from me into the hands of strangers, something inside me loosened that I had not realized was clenched. My truth was no longer trapped inside the walls of my childhood home. It was free, and that was enough. The unintended consequences came quietly. A contractor who had worked with Kyle before refused to renew a deal after hearing rumors that he had a temper problem. A neighbor told my mother she had seen something online about parents missing a daughter's graduation and how awful that must have felt. My father complained to someone at church and received a response he did not like. I heard all of this from distant relatives who whispered to me through text messages. Your blog shook them. They do not know how to spin this. They do not know how to deny it because you did not name them, yet everyone knows. That was when I understood the real power of truth told plainly and anonymously. It does not need names to expose patterns. People recognize themselves in the mirror even when no labels are attached. And for the first time in my life, the truth worked in my favor. The invitation did not arrive as a letter or even as a text. It came as a sudden shift in the tone of my mother's voice, a tone I had not heard since childhood, one she used only when she believed something was slipping beyond her reach. It was late afternoon on a Thursday, and I was in the physical therapy clinic stretching a patient after a hip replacement when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it until my break. When I stepped into the small staff lounge and finally checked the screen, I saw a message from my mother that was startlingly calm after weeks of panic. She wrote, "We need to talk. All of us. Please meet us." It was the please that told me everything. My parents never used that word unless they felt power tilting away from them. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a familiar tension tighten in my chest. Not fear exactly, but a cautious awareness. I knew this pattern too well. They had lost control of the narrative. The blog had spread. People in their community whispered. Kyle was facing consequences he could not bully his way out of, and they were regrouping the way they always did, not to understand me, but to restore the version of events that protected them. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and sat at the edge of the staff couch, inhaling the scent of disinfectant and stale coffee. My mind traveled back to every childhood moment where their conversations had been less about connection and more about correction. Every meeting started with the assumption that I was wrong, that I was dramatic, that I was exaggerating. This time felt different, not because they had changed, but because I had. On my walk home that evening, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and soft ash. The air carried that crisp Colorado chill that always made me feel both alive and solitary in the best way. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my mother. "Emily, we are asking nicely. Your father wants to resolve this before it gets out of hand." I laughed under my breath, a quiet, disbelieving sound that felt almost foreign. Before it gets out of hand. As if I were the one creating chaos. As if their absence at my graduation had been a trivial misstep and not the final confirmation of decades of neglect. I kept walking, letting the cold air sharpen my thoughts. When I got home, I placed my keys on the counter, looked around my small apartment lit by soft lamp glow, and realized this was the first time in my life I had a space that did not feel like enemy territory. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at my dining table, and finally typed the only response I was willing to give. "If you want to talk, it must be in public. A calm place. No yelling. No rewriting the past." When I hit send, I felt a stillness settle inside me. The same stillness I had felt the night I signed my name change petition. I knew they would hate the boundaries. I also knew they needed something from me badly enough that they would agree. 10 minutes later, my father replied, "Fine. Saturday, 3:30. The Oakview Cafe. Be there." I reread the message twice. It was abrupt, clipped, and clearly forced. That alone told me how much they wanted control back. For years, they had dictated time, place, tone, and terms. Now they were accepting mine because they had no other choice. The next day at the clinic, my coworker Lila noticed my quiet mood and asked if everything was okay. I told her only that I had a difficult conversation coming up. She nodded with understanding that did not require explanation. She told me, "Sometimes the hardest part of growing up is realizing the apology you needed will never come in the form you imagined." Her words stayed with me long after she left the room. On Saturday, I arrived at Oakview Cafe 20 minutes early. It was a small place, tucked between a bookstore and a florist with big windows and soft jazz playing inside. The air smelled like cinnamon and roasted coffee beans, and I chose a table near the front where everything was visible and nothing could be twisted into confusion later. I sat with my hands wrapped around a warm mug, steadying myself. I did not feel scared. I felt prepared. At exactly 3:30, the door opened and my mother walked in first, dressed as if she were attending a church luncheon rather than a conversation about decades of hurt. She scanned the room, spotted me, and forced a smile that tightened the muscles in her face. My father followed, his jaw clenched, his posture stiff. The same posture he used when disciplining Kyle's coaches or confronting teachers who dared suggest his son had crossed a line. They sat down across from me, and for a moment, none of us spoke. I studied them quietly, noting how the discomfort was visible in their tense shoulders and restless hands. For once, I did not feel the silence. My mother spoke first. "Emily, we are here because this has gotten out of control. People are talking. Your brother is being judged unfairly. You need to stop this before it ruins our family's reputation." The words landed with the same hollow echo I had heard my entire life. Reputation. Appearances. Image. My father added, "We raised you. We supported you. We do not deserve to be dragged through the mud over one misunderstanding." One misunderstanding. That phrase again, the eraser they used whenever the truth was too inconvenient to face. I felt a sharp pang of old pain, but it did not consume me this time. It only clarified things. I took a slow breath and replied, "You missed my graduation. Not by accident, not because you forgot. You chose to go to Kyle's barbecue, and you laughed in the photos he sent me while two empty seats sat next to me on the most important day of my life." My mother flinched, but recovered quickly, placing her hand on her chest as if offended. "We did not know it meant that much to you." I held her gaze without blinking. "That is the problem." My father leaned forward and lowered his voice as though the cafe patrons might overhear secrets too delicate to share. "You are blowing this out of proportion. You are acting like a child." There it was, the old script. Except now it fell flat. I answered with a steady calmness I had never possessed under their roof. "I am not a child, and this conversation will not continue if you rewrite what happened." For the first time, I saw something flicker in my father's eyes. Not empathy, not understanding, but recognition that I was no longer the version of me they could manage. That was the invitation's true purpose. Not reconciliation. Restoration. They wanted their story back, but I was not giving it to them. My parents had barely finished insisting I was blowing everything out of proportion when the door to the cafe swung open again, letting in a burst of cold air and the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps that moved with the confidence of someone who believed the world should adjust around him. Kyle walked in wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his brow and a heavy jacket that made him look larger than he already was, his eyes sweeping the room until they locked on me with a glare that was equal parts annoyance and entitlement. He did not bother to hide the irritation simmering beneath his expression. Instead of greeting anyone, he strode directly to our table, pulled out the chair beside my father, and sat down with enough force to rattle the silverware. I felt the shift immediately, a tension that thickened the air like static before a storm. My mother reached for his arm and whispered, "You made it just in time," as though his presence were the missing piece of a puzzle they were desperate to solve. He ignored her and looked at me. "So," he said, his voice sharp and flat, "this is the big meeting you made everyone jump through hoops for." His tone was designed to provoke, to reestablish the hierarchy that had existed my entire childhood. I kept my voice even when I answered. I agreed to talk, not to be talked over. My father shot me a warning glance, but Kyle leaned forward, elbows on the table, invading the small space between us like he always used to when he wanted me to shrink. "You think you are better than us now because you got a degree and wrote some crybaby blog online." His words were loud enough that two people at the table beside us glanced over. I stayed still. "I am not responsible for how people reacted to the truth." His jaw tensed, and he let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Truth. You want to talk about truth? Let us talk about how you have always twisted everything to make yourself look like a victim." My mother touched his wrist gently, as if reminding him to lower his voice, but he shook her off. His volume rose a notch. You could have come to the barbecue, you know. You could have been there if it mattered that much. Heat spread across my chest. Not shame, but disbelief. You know parents are supposed to show up for their children, right? Kyle rolled his eyes. You act like a ceremony is life or death. People miss things sometimes. You move on. That casual dismissal delivered with the same flippant tone he used when he broke my belongings as a teenager hit me with a clarity that cut deeper than anger ever could. This was who he was. This was who he had always been. And my parents had always protected that version of him at the expense of me. My mother folded her hands tightly on the table. Emily, honey, we are here to fix things, not argue. The word fix made something settle in my spine. Fixing things meant smoothing over the truth, burying it, returning to the script where Kyle's comfort mattered more than anyone else's reality. I said calmly, I am not here to fix anything. I am here to say what happened. Nothing more. Kyle scoffed and pushed his chair back slightly, as if physically preparing to dominate the conversation. His knee bumped the table and my water glass trembled. Why did you even bother coming if you are just going to lecture everyone? He shot me a look that carried the familiar edge I remembered from childhood, the one that said he could shut this down with a single aggressive gesture if he wanted to. He leaned forward again and pointed at my chest. You always take everything personally. You always make everything about you. There it was, the script I knew by heart. My father added, you did not have to expose us online. At that, something inside me stilled completely. I reached into my bag and took out my phone. Without emotion, without hesitation, I placed it on the table and pulled up the photos Kyle had sent me on graduation day. I turned the screen toward them, time stamped. 4:06, 4:12, 4:19. Him posing with his friends. My parents laughing behind him. While I crossed the stage alone, my mother's lips pressed into a thin line. My father shifted in his seat. Kyle stared at the screen with irritation, not remorse. He snorted. So what? You saw a picture. Big deal. And then, with a smirk, he added, maybe if you were not so sensitive, you would not need people clapping for you every time you do something basic. The words hit the table like a slap, sharp and cold. A woman at the next table glanced up sharply, eyebrows raised. She looked at me not the way people look at spectacle, but with the quiet, protective instinct of someone who has seen emotional abuse before. She gave me the smallest nod, almost invisible. It steadied me. Kyle leaned closer, lowering his voice, but sharpening the threat beneath it. You think changing your name makes you someone new? It doesn't. You will always be one of us. He reached out suddenly, and his hand came toward my forearm, a reflex he had used my entire childhood to force me into private conversations or pull me out of rooms. But this time I moved back quickly, my chair scraping softly on the floor as I created distance before he could grab me. The motion was simple, instinctive, and firm. No. The word came out steady and loud enough that the entire table froze. Kyle blinked as if stunned that I had rejected the gesture so directly. A barista behind the counter paused mid-drink. The woman at the next table gently placed her hand on the back of her chair and spoke, her voice even and authoritative. She said, "She told you no. Do not touch her." The moment hung in the air, heavy and perfectly still, the kind of silence that cracks power in half. Kyle turned toward the woman, mortified, his face flushing. He muttered something under his breath, then sat back, folding his arms tightly across his chest. For the first time, I saw him look small. My father cleared his throat. "We are not doing this in public." I kept my eyes on him and answered, "Yes, we are. Because for 27 years, everything private in our house was designed to protect you three and silence me. That ends today." My mother tried to reach for my hand across the table, but I drew it back calmly. Her face tightened. "So, this is it. You are abandoning your family." I shook my head slowly. I am not abandoning anyone. I am removing myself from a system that never saw me. I am choosing peace over proximity, and for the first time, I do not feel guilty about it. The confrontation did not end with shouting. It ended with silence. A thick, suffocating silence none of them could break. Kyle looked away, jaw tight. My mother stared at the tablecloth as if it held answers she could not find. My father exhaled sharply, a defeated sound, and said nothing. I stood up quietly, picked up my phone, and placed a few dollars on the table for my coffee. None of them moved. None of them called after me. When I stepped out of the cafe and felt the cold wind hit my face, I realized I had not just confronted them, I had outgrown them. When I stepped out of the cafe that afternoon, the wind rushed against my face like a clean slate, cold but strangely invigorating, as if the air itself recognized that something irreversible had just happened inside those four walls. I stood there for a moment, watching my breath form faint clouds in the crisp Colorado air, letting the weight of the confrontation settle into the quiet spaces inside me. There was no shaking in my hands, no lingering tremor in my chest, only a grounded certainty that felt new and unfamiliar, like finally standing on steady earth after a lifetime of uneven ground. That evening, after returning to my apartment, I sat at my dining table with a cup of peppermint tea and opened my laptop. I had prepared for this moment long before the cafe meeting, drafting the documents I knew I would eventually need. The first was a written notice of my boundaries, not emotional, not filled with accusations, simply factual, the kind of clarity I once believed families were naturally capable of offering each other. It outlined 3 points. First, all communication from now on was to be in writing only. Second, no unannounced visits or attempts to contact my workplace were permitted. Third, any further attempts to emotionally manipulate or intimidate me would result in a formal no-contact order. It felt surreal typing it, not because it was harsh, but because it was reasonable. And reason was something my family had always demanded from me while rarely offering it in return. I printed the letters, signed them with the name I had grown into Emily Ellis, and placed each one into its own envelope. The next morning, I mailed them certified, watching the postal clerk stamp each envelope with the quiet efficiency of someone who handled countless transitions every day, unaware that this simple motion marked the end of an era for me. When I got back home, I blocked my parents' numbers, then Kyle's, then every cousin or aunt who had sent me guilt-soaked messages over the past few weeks. The silence that followed was immediate and profound. It was not empty. It was restful. It was protective. And yet even silence has a way of revealing who refuses to accept boundaries. The next afternoon, my building's intercom buzzed loudly, shattering the peaceful quiet of my living room. I froze for half a second before walking slowly to the panel. A familiar voice crackled through the static. "Emily, it's your mother. Buzz us in." There was no anger in her tone, only expectation. The assumption that, of course, I would open the door because for 27 years I always had. I pressed the button and replied, "I will not be letting you in. All communication must be written." Then I removed my finger from the button before she could respond. The intercom buzzed twice more longer and louder, but I walked away. 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated with an email notification from my father. He wrote, "We are downstairs. We need to talk. Come out now." I read it once, then deleted it without replying. My hands were steady. My heartbeat did not spike. The fear that used to grip me whenever my father used commanding language simply did not exist anymore. A few hours later, another email arrived, this time from Kyle. Unlike my parents' messages, his was short and simmering with irritation. "You think a piece of paper stops anyone from seeing you? You are not better than us. You are just running away." I stared at the words for a moment, then archived the message. His frustration was not new. What was new was my refusal to carry it. That evening, I contacted the property manager for my building and requested that no one be allowed access to my floor without my permission. He agreed immediately, explaining that tenant safety was always a priority. Hearing those words from someone who had no emotional stake in the situation made me realize how simple it was for strangers to respect boundaries when my own family could not. 2 days later, the certified letters I mailed were delivered. The confirmation emails came through just after noon as I was finishing paperwork at the clinic. I stared at the digital receipts, each one marking a boundary officially received, officially acknowledged, officially undeniable. That night, the emails from my parents escalated in tone. My mother wrote, "I cannot believe you would humiliate us like this. Blocking us is cruel. We are your parents. You owe us respect." My father added, Your childish behavior has gone on long enough. End this nonsense before it destroys any chance of reconciliation. Not once did they mention the graduation. Not once did they mention the empty chairs. Not once did they mention the photos I had shown them at the cafe. Their messages were not about connection. They were about access, about entitlement, about the belief that proximity was something they could demand without earning. I responded once, choosing my words with the precision of someone who had finally learned the difference between firmness and cruelty. I wrote, "I am not responsible for your feelings about my boundaries. Do not contact me again unless it is in writing and respectful. Any further attempts to appear at my home in person will be documented." After sending the email, I sat on my bed in the quiet of my apartment, letting the stillness settle around me like a protective layer. For years, I had believed that setting boundaries made me difficult, ungrateful, dramatic. Now I understood that boundaries only feel like attacks to people who benefit from your lack of them. The next morning, I received one final email from my mother. It said, "You will regret losing your family. One day, you will understand what you have done." I read it slowly, then closed my laptop. There was no sting to her words, no guilt, only clarity. I whispered to myself I did not lose my family. I left a dynamic that refused to see me. And the truth of that sentence filled the room like warm light. Cutting them off was not about revenge. It was about survival. It was about peace. It was about choosing a life where my worth was not negotiable. When the silence finally returned deep and undisturbed, I realized the final cut had already happened long before the cafe confrontation. This was simply the moment I honored it. The real consequences did not arrive with sirens or dramatic confrontations or some explosive moment of karmic spectacle, but rather slowly, quietly, like a series of small dominoes, tipping one after another in the weeks following the cafe meeting. I did not plan their downfall. I did not orchestrate anything. I simply took myself out of the equation, and the absence they once considered insignificant began to expose cracks they had spent years covering with excuses. The first sign came in the form of a message from an old neighbor back in our hometown. She wrote to congratulate me again on my degree, and mentioned almost casually that people around the community were confused about why my parents had not attended the ceremony. Apparently, someone at the grocery store had overheard my mother trying to explain it away, claiming they had been double booked and that my graduation was not as big a deal as people made it out to be. The neighbor added, "I do not think people were convinced. They kept asking follow-up questions." I reread the message twice, feeling a subtle shift inside me, a recognition that for once it was not my voice against theirs. It was their own story working against them. Word spread quickly in suburban towns where reputations were built on consistency and family unity. For years, my parents had curated an image of being deeply involved, attentive, and supportive. When people realized they had missed their daughter's doctoral graduation for a barbecue, eyebrows were raised. They tried to offer explanations, but explanations require truth or skill, and they had neither. Next came Kyle's unraveling, not in a violent explosion, but in a slow, predictable pattern that had always existed beneath the surface. I heard about it through a former classmate who still lived in town and followed some of the same local business pages I used to. She sent me a link one evening showing a short video clip from a neighborhood gathering. In the video, Kyle was visibly intoxicated, loudly arguing with someone off camera, gesturing aggressively while a few guests tried to calm him down. No punches were thrown, no one was hurt, but the visual spoke volumes. The caption beneath the video simply read, "There he goes again." This was followed by several comments hinting that this was not an isolated incident. It only took a day for that clip to circulate among the business owners he relied on for contracting jobs. A handful of them wrote that they were reconsidering partnerships due to temperament concerns. I closed the video after watching half of it not out of distress, but out of a strange sense of affirmation. Kyle's issues had always been handled privately, shielded by my parents' insistence that he was under pressure, that people did not understand him, that I should stop provoking him. Now that shield was gone. Without me to absorb the consequences of his behavior, the world finally saw him as he truly was, unpredictable, volatile, and lacking accountability. Then came the fallout for my father. My father had always cared deeply about his status in the community. He served on the board of a local club, attended every fundraiser, and prided himself on being a respected figure among his peers. But when word spread that he had skipped his daughter's doctoral graduation, a few members quietly questioned his judgment. The whispers were not cruel, they were simply factual. Someone said, "If he cannot show up for his daughter's biggest milestone, how reliable is he for our organization?" Others began to observe his defensiveness during discussions. He snapped more quickly, rolled his eyes dismissively at colleagues, and appeared agitated in meetings. Eventually, he stepped down from a committee he had chaired for years, citing stress. My mother did not fare much better in social circles. The same people who used to admire her polished holiday photos now began pulling back. She was not invited to a couple of events. A neighbor reportedly asked her directly, "Why did you not go to Emily's graduation?" And according to a relative, my mother became so flustered she blamed traffic illness and even the weather before finally giving up and leaving the conversation mid-sentence. These were not catastrophic punishments. No one was shouting at them. No one was ruining their lives. The world was simply reflecting back the truth they had tried to hide for years. And truth, when left undisturbed, carries consequences of its own. Meanwhile, I remained completely uninvolved. I did not post anything new on my blog about them. I did not share the video of Kyle's argument. I did not speak to anyone in town or defend myself against the narratives my parents were surely still constructing. I was busy rebuilding, busy healing, busy existing without flinching. But their messages continued dripping into my inbox with a mixture of anger, guilt, and desperation. My father wrote, "This is spiraling out of control. You need to fix this." My mother wrote, "People think we are monsters. You did this to us." Kyle sent one last message, "You ruined my business. Hope you are happy." I read each one once, then archived them. Not out of coldness, but out of clarity. Their consequences were not my responsibility. They were the natural result of their choices. People had always warned them that coddling Kyle and neglecting me would backfire someday. That someday arrived not with my vengeance, but with their own patterns meeting daylight. The truth is that consequences do not need anger or escalation. They do not need revenge or intervention. Sometimes the simple act of stepping away, of removing yourself from a dysfunctional system, forces the system to finally face itself. Without me there to absorb the unfairness, to smooth over Kyle's temper, to lift my parents' image by being the silent and successful daughter, their structure faltered under its own weight. And as I watched this unfold from a distance, I felt no triumph and no regret, only release. Rebuilding my life under my new name did not begin with a dramatic sunrise or a symbolic box of belongings carried into a new apartment the way movies like to pretend healing works. It began quietly, almost unceremoniously, with me unlocking the door to a small one-bedroom place in Boulder that smelled faintly of fresh paint and pine air freshener, the kind maintenance staff plug in before new tenants arrive. I stood in the middle of the empty living room, my suitcase beside me, and whispered my name out loud, testing the syllables in the stillness. Emily Ellis. The name fit the room, fit the air, fit the quiet. It fit me. For the first few days, I lived among cardboard boxes, sleeping on a mattress on the floor because I had not figured out the bed frame yet. Every time I looked around, the absence of my old life echoed faintly, not painfully, but like an old bruise that no longer hurt, yet still reminded me where an injury once lived. I decorated slowly, placing things with intention. A small shelf for my physical therapy textbooks. A couple of framed prints of mountain trails I hoped to hike one day. A soft blue throw blanket draped across the couch to make the space feel less temporary. I bought a plant at a local nursery, a sturdy pothos with thick, trailing vines. The cashier told me, "These are hard to kill," and I thought, what a relief, finally something in my life that can survive inconsistency. Work at the new rehab center began quietly. My first day as Dr. Ellis felt surreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life. I introduced myself to the front desk assistant, a cheerful young man who handed me paperwork and said, "Welcome aboard," without glancing twice at my name badge. In that moment, I understood the power of starting over. No one here knew the girl who stood alone at her graduation. No one knew about Kyle's temper or my parents' favoritism. No one had a script for who I was supposed to be, and the freedom of that blankness felt like oxygen in my lungs. My supervisor, an older therapist named Joanna with silver hair and a pragmatic sense of humor, took me under her wing. She taught me the rhythm of the clinic, how to manage the heavy caseload, which patients tended to cancel last minute, which ones needed encouragement, which ones needed boundaries. During one of our lunch breaks, she glanced at me over her sandwich and said, "You are good with people, not just the easy ones. You listen in a way that makes people feel seen." I swallowed hard because no one in my family had ever used the word seen when referring to me. At home, being seen had always meant being scrutinized, judged, or overshadowed by someone louder. Here, it meant something else entirely. Over the next few months, I developed routines. Mornings began with a quiet cup of coffee on my small balcony, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Workdays ended with me walking home past the aroma of a nearby bakery that always smelled like cinnamon and warm bread. I joined a small peer group for therapists, not because I wanted to talk about my family, but because I wanted to be around people who understood emotional labor without needing it explained. During one session, we shared why we chose this field. When my turn came, I simply said I wanted to be the person I needed growing up, and the room fell into a thoughtful silence that felt warm, not heavy. I made friends slowly. There was Leah, a neighbor across the hall who always watered her plants at midnight and invited me over for tea after long shifts. There was Max, a physical therapist assistant who loved hiking and introduced me to a trail that wound past a hidden creek. There was Sam, one of the clinic nurses who never pried, but always noticed when I seemed tired and handed me an extra granola bar with a simple, "You look like you need fuel." These small gestures formed the skeleton of something I had not experienced before. Chosen family people who showed up not because of obligation or blood, but because they simply cared. Meanwhile, I kept writing on my blog anonymously. Not about my parents, not anymore. I wrote about childhood roles, about how some kids become peacekeepers while others become the family scapegoat. I wrote about emotional neglect, about the invisible weight of being the functional one, the steady one, the one who never receives attention unless something goes wrong. Readers responded with gratitude, sharing stories of their own stories that echoed mine in ways that were both comforting and heartbreaking. Over time, I realized I was building something bigger than myself, a small community of people learning to breathe after living for years in environments that smothered them. Healing showed up in unexpected moments. It showed up the day I bought a new phone plan under the name Emily Ellis and felt no fear that my parents might try to track me down. It showed up the day I completed a complex treatment plan for a stroke patient, and she hugged me saying, "You saved my life in more ways than one." It showed up on a Saturday morning when I drove to a trailhead and hiked alone, noticing the sound of my footsteps on gravel and the smell of pine trees after a drizzle. For the first time, solitude did not feel like abandonment. It felt like choice. A year after moving to Boulder, as I sat in my apartment surrounded by the soft hum of evening, I realized I had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. I no longer flinched when the intercom buzzed. I no longer feared unfamiliar numbers. I no longer braced myself for disappointment. My life was simple, steady, and peaceful in ways I had not known were possible. One evening, while tidying the bookshelf, I found an old photo I had vaguely packed during the move. A picture of me at 8 years old with my grandmother, the original Ellis, the woman whose unconditional love had taught me what being chosen felt like. In the photo, she was kneeling beside me, holding my shoulders with the kind of gentle pride I had spent years trying to earn from my parents. I traced the edges of the picture and whispered softly, "Thank you." Rebuilding my life did not mean erasing the past. It meant understanding it, honoring the parts that shaped me, and releasing the parts that caged me. Under my new name, I was not hiding. I was emerging. For the first time in my life, I was fully visible to myself. The day I stopped being a ghost did not arrive with fanfare or applause or some cinematic bolt of clarity crashing through my life. It came quietly, the way dawn comes to a sleeping city, barely noticeable until the light has already settled across everything. It happened one ordinary Thursday morning when I received an email from the Colorado courts stating that my legal name change had been fully processed and recorded. The document was attached a simple PDF with black text on a white background, but as I opened it, I felt something inside my chest loosen like a knot that had been pulled tight for decades, finally slipping free. I read the words twice, then 3 times, Emily Grace Ellis recognized by the state of Colorado as my legal and only name. No mention of Parker. No shadow trailing behind me. No history I was required to carry. I printed the document at the clinic before my shift began, listening to the soft clicking of the machine as each line of text appeared, and when I held the warm paper in my hand, I felt an unexpected rush of emotion wash over me. It was not joy exactly, not triumph. It was a deep, resonant exhale from a place inside me I had forgotten how to access. After work, I drove to a quiet overlook on the outskirts of Boulder where the mountains stretched under the sky like folded blankets. I parked my car, took the document with me, and walked up the small incline until the wind brushed against my hair and the gravel crunched beneath my feet. Standing there, I said my name aloud, letting it sink into the open air. Emily Ellis. The sound settled into the valley steady and certain. For years, I had felt like a ghost in my own family, visible only when it was convenient, for others translucent, when I needed someone to stay acknowledged only in ways that did not disrupt Kyle's spotlight. I had walked through milestones alone, spoken softly so I would not be accused of drama, folded myself small to avoid the friction that came whenever I existed too loudly. But up there on the overlook, with the wind carrying the echo of my own voice back to me, I felt anchored, tangible, solid, alive in a way I had never been allowed to feel under the name Parker. After leaving the overlook, I stopped by the DMV to update my identification card. The line was long, a coil of tired people waiting for paperwork to be stamped, signatures to be checked, photos to be taken. There was nothing glamorous about it, but when the clerk called my name and I stepped forward with my documents, I felt a strange warmth spread across my chest. She typed my information, glanced at the court order, and said, "Congratulations, Ms. Ellis." I smiled because hearing it from a stranger made it real in a way that nothing else had. When she snapped my photo, the camera flash caught my eyes just right, and for the first time in years, I liked what I saw on the screen. Not because I looked perfect, but because I looked present. Not fading, not bracing. Present. That night, I cooked dinner in my small kitchen, humming softly as I sautéed vegetables and boiled pasta. It was a simple meal, but simple things had grown sacred to me. The clinking of a fork against a bowl, the warm light over my table, the quiet hum of my refrigerator, the knowledge that no one would burst through the door demanding something from me. After dinner, I sat at my desk and wrote in my journal, something my therapist had once encouraged me to do. I wrote about the empty seats at my graduation, about the photo Kyle sent, about the years of being overshadowed, minimized, dismissed. Then I wrote about my new apartment, my coworkers, the patients who trusted me with their pain, the friends who checked on me without needing a reason. I wrote about how healing does not announce itself. It sneaks in through small moments, a morning cup of coffee on a balcony, a coworker saying they appreciate you, a hike that leaves your legs tired but your heart steady, a new name printed on a court order. I wrote until the words turned blurry and my hand began to ache, and then I closed the journal and sat back, feeling a deep calm wash over me. I realized I had not thought about Kyle's temper in weeks. I had not flinched at the sound of my phone buzzing. I had not rehearsed conversations in my head where I finally convinced my parents to understand my hurt. I no longer needed their understanding. I no longer needed their recognition. I no longer needed their apology to breathe. In that moment, I understood something quietly profound. Closure does not come from people suddenly becoming who they should have been. Closure comes from choosing yourself even when others refuse to. A few days later, I stopped by the post office and closed my old P.O. box tied to the Parker name. As I turned in the key, the clerk said, "You transferring to a new one?" I nodded and handed over the form with the name Emily Ellis written neatly on the top line. She smiled, stamped the paper, and slid a new key across the counter. As I walked back to my car, the late afternoon sun warmed my shoulders, and I felt lighter than I had in years. That evening, my neighbor Leah knocked on my door holding a small pot of lavender she had picked up at a plant fair. "This is for your new beginning," she said, placing it in my hands. The gesture was simple, but my eyes stung with unexpected tears. People who choose you see you without needing a reason. Later that night, as I watered the lavender and placed it by the window, I whispered something into the quiet apartment. I am not a ghost anymore. I said it with certainty, with peace, with a softness that felt earned. I no longer lived in the shadow of a family who only valued me in theory. I no longer drifted through milestones alone, hoping someone would finally notice I had grown. I no longer begged for a place in a narrative that never made room for me. Standing there in the warm glow of my living room lavender, filling the air with a faint floral sweetness, I knew the truth with a clarity that settled deep into my bones. Leaving was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of restoration, and for the first time in my life, I felt whole. If you stayed with me through this entire story, I want to ask you something straight from the heart because chances are, if you are still here, you have known a version of this pain too. Maybe not the same details, maybe not a skipped graduation or a brother who always took up all the air in the room, but something quieter, something familiar, that feeling of being the child who showed up for everyone while no one showed up for you. And now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I ask not because of the algorithm, but because stories like this become powerful only when people across states, across time zones, across generations recognize themselves in it and realize they are not alone. So let me ask the real question, the one this entire journey leads to. If your family skipped the biggest milestone of your life, not because of illness or emergency or anything unavoidable, but simply because someone else was louder, easier, more convenient to support, what would you do? Would you swallow it to keep the peace, the way so many of us have been taught to do? Or would you finally draw a line, not in anger, but in self-respect, and choose a life where your worth does not depend on someone else's comfort? And before you answer, think about this. How many years have you tried to earn the kind of love that should have been freely given? How many birthdays, graduations, ceremonies, hospital visits, quiet moments have you sat through alone because you were told not to make things dramatic or difficult or inconvenient? At what point does staying become the real act of betrayal? Not to them, but to yourself. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of a moment when you realized your value did not fit inside the small box your family tried to keep you in, tell me in the comments. You do not need to share details if you do not want to. Just tell me yes. This hit home, or yes, I have been the ghost child, or yes, I know what it feels like to finally breathe after leaving. And if you are comfortable, share the city or state you are watching from so we can see how far stories of quiet courage travel. And if you have someone in your life who always showed up for you, someone who made you feel seen when your own family could not tag them or tell them you love them, chosen family is real, and sometimes it is the only thing that helps us rebuild. And before you go, remember this final thought. Walking away from people who refuse to see you is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of healing. It is not revenge. It is self-protection. And you are allowed to choose a life with less noise, less guilt, and more peace. If this story moved you, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that choosing themselves is not selfish. It might just be the first real breath they have taken in years.